Kia ora committee members, and welcome everybody to the committee Iti Arataka Mahari e Rohi District Plan Review Subcommittee. This is our final. We've got all the papers today that we need to work through, and we have had a workshop before this meeting where we have ironed out a lot of questions. So we're going to start with our karakia. Get back to the start. So follow me with you, officers and councillors. Whakatakata hou ki te uru, whakatakata hou ki te tonga. Kia mā kinga kinga tuuta, kia mā taratara ki tai. I he aki ana ti atakura, he tio, he huka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora. Okay. So I'm just going to note Understanding Order 13.10. As the chair of the meeting is attending via audio visual link, I'll be undertaking the chair's duties for this particular meeting. Members are asked to have their videos on at all times, and for any members joining via Zoom, videos on. If you've got questions during the debate, please let me know verbally. And if the division is called for, Director of Environment and Sustainability will record the names and members voting for and against the motion, and we will declare a result. I don't think we'll get that far. Okay, Councillor Brown.
Could I please note that I have to leave by 3:15? I'm just aware that will we have a quorum?
Thank you. I think I'll just confirm we do have a quorum. It's 4. Yes, we will. Thank you, Councillor Brown. Okay, so apologies. I've received one from Māori Dentist. Is there any update on that? No? It's her apology, okay. Okay, so can I move that we accept that apology? Councillor Brown, all in those in favour, please say aye. Aye. Okie doke. So public comment, we haven't received any public comment. Any conflicts of interest? No, can't see any on the screen. The minutes, page 5 of the agenda. Does anybody have any questions relating to the correctness of these minutes? I can't see any hands going up. So I move that the minutes of the District Plan Review Subcommittee held on Tuesday 12th of May be confirmed as true and correct record. Seconder, Councillor Brown. No debate. I'll put the motion. All those in favour, please say aye. Aye, thank you. So now we've got the recommendations to that's going to go to the Policy and Finance Strategy Committee on Council on the 5th of July. And the final draft intensification planning instrument is on page 11. And I'm just going to take the paper as read and ask Nathan if he would like to speak to it, please.
I'm happy to take the paper as read. It's really just the culmination of all of the work that's gone on in recent months on Council's intensification planning instrument. A intensification plan change that's required through amendments to the Resource Management Act from late last year. A intensification planning instrument must be notified by the 20th of August this year, and this report is effectively presenting the final draft of that planning instrument, of that plan change for the subcommittee's consideration.
Thank you. I've got questions coming in from first Councillor Dyer and then Councillor Brown.
Thank you, Chair. Just checking you can hear me fine in the chambers.
Yeah, you're good to go.
Cool, awesome. Firstly, can I just commend officers at the point that we're at right now? It's made this final draft IPI so much easier to read and make final decisions on because of the amount of work that you've done to date. Both in formal meetings and workshops, but also just the language that's been used, explaining what is a really, really complicated topic to us. It's really made today's decision a much easier decision. My question is regarding the timeframes with this meeting recommending to Policy and Finance, recommending to full council, in terms of if there were to be any changes to the draft. Are we still able to make changes right up until full council sign off, or do they need to be done sooner than later? Well, obviously they need to be done sooner than later, but is there a cutoff point that they have to be made before then, or can it be changed right up until the last minute?
Thank you, Councillor Dyer. We were planning to take this to the Policy and Strategy Committee and the draft papers were due on Monday, but we will be able to. That's the draft agenda meeting, Annie, I think. Is that the draft agenda meeting? No, that's the actual meeting, isn't it? Okay, so we will have a few days to make some changes prior to the policy meeting. If there are more substantial changes, then we will have to look at what we can do in terms of supplementary meetings, etc., to be able to have time to draft those changes and then get it through a committee.
So there would be time, even if we can't make those changes before the full council meeting as currently is proposed, that an extraordinary meeting could be held and still get within the timeframes of the August deadlines we've got.
Well, the agenda goes out on Tuesday for the policy committee, and ideally we would have something before the policy committee that could recommend it through to full council. If there were more substantial changes, I think we'd have to have a look at how we can handle that. But we may be able to, I don't know if we would have to hold a special policy meeting or whether it would be able to go through to full council. I just actually don't know the answer to that question, but I may well be able to find out before the end of the meeting if that's helpful. So sorry, I haven't got that in my head.
Cool, thank you.
Councillor Brown. Councillor Shaw.
Sorry, I was just pointing to Councillor Brady.
Yeah, thank you for the work done on this document, and I agree with Councillor Dyer. The language used has made it much more understandable. I do have a question in regard, that's come back from mana whenua feedback summary, and I'm specifically looking at page 41. And thanks for the workshop before, because I think you answered a lot of the questions I had then. But there is one here in regards to sites of significance to Māori, and that is in regards to Ōwhiti and Korokoro Urupā. Are both of those urupā protected by a resource consent process from high density development? They currently sit, Ōwhiti sits under general business activity, and Korokoro is not identified as a site of significance. But my question is around, are they still protected by a resource consent process?
I'll pass that inquiry on to Stephen Davis and Emily Campbell, who's been working on that part of the intensification plan change.
The operative district plan already has protections for Te Puni Urupā, which include a recession plan for all buildings on neighbouring sites and across the road, which triggers a resource consent assessment, which would include engagement with mana whenua about protecting that site. Ōwhiti Urupā has protection in the form of a setback, but I don't believe a recession plan, because the surrounding special business activity area is not being changed through the IPI, because it's not in a walkable catchment. It's not within scope of the IPI to change that approach in any way, but it's something we want to look again in the full review. And I think Emily's looking like she wants to say something. Do you want to?
I was just going to add that it's also recognised as a site of significance, which does have a resource consent trigger on that in terms of assessing those values, assessing development on that site in terms of cultural values.
In terms of Korokoro, that's not identified either through the community activity area or a site of significance at the moment, but it's something we'll be looking at in the full review, and in the short term I don't think there's significant risk to it given its ownership and the only immediate neighbour is the park and ride.
Councillor Dyer?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, my question's also on some of the kind of a follow-on from the mana whenua feedback. It was really good to have that here on the papers today, and I think we can wholeheartedly agree with a lot of the concerns that they have. They're very similar to the concerns that we raised in our submission to the government when they were proposing this. We've obviously made some changes as a result of their feedback in terms of the setbacks on neighbouring properties around the urupa, not necessarily the actual site itself. Just wondering what's being proposed, and I haven't been able to find it easily. So this is my question, is around the heritage precincts. Are we proposing a similar setback rule on abutting sites, not the ones necessarily within the precinct itself?
The heritage areas that are identified include within them a sort of buffer area for consideration of protection of those heritage areas. So often the heritage area extends a bit beyond the individually listed items to include that consideration of the effect that buildings outside might have. So it's not at the edge of the heritage area, it's rather incorporated into defining what the heritage area is in the first place.
Okay, are there any further questions? No? Councillor Dyer, I thought you might have some more.
Sorry, just looking backwards and forwards between previous questions that we've had the opportunity to ask. Had a question, the paper talks about some parts of the IPI taking legal effect once it's notified in August. Just wondering if officers could explain which parts of the IPI take immediate legal effect and when the others would come into effect. Do they all come into effect at the same time once it's signed off by council at the very end of the process, or is it staggered? Or just be really good to be really clear about which parts take immediate effect and which ones are delayed.
It's fair to say that it's a bit of a complicated part of the intensification planning instrument requirements. One thing for certain is the medium density residential standards take immediate legal effect from when the plan change is notified. It's a little bit less clear when looking at the approach that the plan change takes to enabling 6-storey buildings, or when the plan change would go above and beyond the minimum requirements, I suppose, of the medium density residential standards. We can report back with clear information on that through the Policy and Regulatory Committee, if that's helpful. I just don't have the information right in front of me.
Yeah, thank you. That would be really useful. Another follow-on question I've got is regarding the 60% site coverage that's been proposed in the high density zone. What impact would that have if we were to change that to 50 in terms of people that are currently going through resource consent process or about to start developing? Would we see a huge influx of applications trying to get in before we formally notify the plan change? Just wonder if you could talk a bit about what impacts changing from 60 to 50 at this stage would cause.
So if it's a development that resource consent application has already been applied for, then that application would be processed under the existing provisions of the district plan. So this wouldn't affect that at all. It's effectively, the Resource Management Act effectively prevents the council from changing the rules out from underneath someone who's already lodged an application. As far as someone who may be looking at lodging an application and hasn't yet lodged the application and is aware that council is looking at reducing the site coverage from 60% of the site to 50% of the site, in some cases that may be to the point that that a developer feels that they need to act quickly to take advantage of that more permissive standard and get a development underway under the existing provisions. So I guess there is a risk that there is an influx of applications between now and when the plan is changed. it's a little bit difficult to anticipate how the development community would respond. My suspicion is that it wouldn't result in a lot of people all of a sudden lodging applications in the next couple of months. But there is a chance that there would be some. But I do note that the medium density residential standards in general are more enabling of development than what the district plan currently is. What I think you're more likely to see is developers waiting for the medium density residential standards to be incorporated into the district plan to take advantage of that more enabling set of standards, rather than people trying to rush in and get ahead of the intensification plan change being notified to take advantage of that one particular standard.
Cool, thank you. And one final question I've got is just regarding how Riverlink works into this plan change process. Obviously, I understand it's still going through the resource consent process, and that a future plan change and the full district plan is probably the best place for it. But is there any elements of Riverlink that we could incorporate into the IPI that's going to, if anyone decides to start developing in the CBD in the next 3 or 4 years before that process takes place, we're going to get some better outcomes? I'm thinking particularly along the new Margaret Street pedestrian corridor, and also where the new Melling Bridge is proposed to land into the CBD, and also the new CBD bypass around the southeastern side of the CBD. Is there any things we could be doing in those areas now, noting that there will be development in those areas between now and when Riverlink gets to that stage?
So again, Stephen Davis has been leading the commercial aspect of this plan change and also the full district plan review. So I'll pass it over to Stephen to respond to that.
We've worked with the Riverlink team in preparing this plan change. The draft doesn't include many significant changes as a response to Riverlink, because the consenting is not quite finished yet, and it's conceivable things could change in the future. And we do expect that we will need either a new standalone plan change for Riverlink, or to incorporate into the full plan review to get the outcomes we need from Riverlink once that's more certain. There are a few very minor sort of areas where we've tried to look ahead. Probably the key one is in the city centre, changing the rules about developments that front onto the stop bank to encourage them to be integrated with the stop bank, rather than what the plan currently does, which is somewhat paradoxically discouraging them from doing that.
Councillor Dyer, I have an answer to your question. So we can provide a supplementary agenda or report by the 30th of June or the 1st of July at the outside. So that means if there are changes, the officers will be able to have the benefit of nearly a week to make those changes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Helen. Councillor Edwards, hello, nice to see you.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. So just a follow-up question to what Brady was talking about, and it may be a very difficult question to answer, and logic tells me what the difference is between 60% and 50%, but I'm just wondering whether you could give any additional information if the committee was of a mind in the high density areas to change from the 60% to the 50%, whether that kind of makes it significantly more difficult for dense or tall buildings, some of which we really want to see. And Councillor Dyer was asking about Riverlink in particular, where it might actually be what might actually be very good to see some taller and denser buildings along that riverfront, and the inner city apartments that we're looking to see, especially in the central city. So yeah, my question is that from a developer's perspective, is a 60% site coverage versus 50%, a really quite a significant change and likely to rule out some developments?
With regards to Riverlink and building on the stop bank there in the city centre, the site coverage standard there's no currently a site coverage standard in the city centre. and there's not one proposed in the IPI. Buildings can be built covering the entire site in the central commercial activity area, and we certainly plan to continue that and continue encouraging buildings to be built up to the street front and making the best use of that. In terms of residential areas, I think Nathan can comment on that.
It is definitely a reduction in the amount of development that could happen on a site, and there may be situations where that smaller level of development that is permitted is, I guess, the tipping point that prevents the development from being able to occur. But I note that while the standard would be 50%, the permitted activity standard would be 50%, a developer could still apply for a resource consent application to go for a greater site coverage if they wish to do so. That adds cost to that development, which is why that could result in a development no longer going ahead just because of those added costs associated with going through a resource consent application. But it effectively lowers the trigger that for the resource consent, which lowers the trigger for where the impacts of a development of the buildings of a development on the surrounding area and the amenity values of the surrounding area get considered on the case-by-case basis for that resource consent application. So as far as actually trying to quantify how many fewer developments would occur or to even give an indication of that, I probably can't say. But yeah, I think those are the key considerations, is that it can result in a development not going ahead, but the resource consent process is still available for people that do want to exceed that standard.
Councillor Dyer.
Thank you. Final one from me on the 50-60% site coverage. Just want to make sure that I am correct in my thinking that the current rules of 60% take into account the fact that our sites are generally have more setback shading. So in theory, we're allowing more intensification to happen within the site, but the new rules being proposed, the bottom lines that we have to do, the minimum, allows much more intensification sort of in, I'm trying to use my hands, but in the envelope, there's a lot more is allowed under the new medium density rules that we have to follow. So that changing from 60 to 50, while also incorporating all the other changes that the standards take into account, actually would allow much more intensification. Even if we drop back to 50%, from 60 to 50 would still allow much more housing on that specific site.
It certainly would. The new standards that effectively allow a new building to go taller, nearer the boundaries of a site, certainly does enable more development to occur as a permitted activity if you can fit within that that building envelope. I guess I couldn't say whether that's a little bit more or much more. It's certainly a lot more permissive than what the district plan currently allows, but whether that would actually result in a lot more development to occur, I'm not certain. It's a lot more permissive of 3-storey buildings at least, and that's the combination of both that more permissive recession plane and a more permissive maximum height standard.
So would you be able to say with those two more permissive elements that if it was dropped to 50%, it would still enable more on the site than 60% currently provides?
It's a little bit difficult to say for certain because a lot of this starts to depend on the particular site that you're dealing with. If we're just sort of thinking in a world where every site is a perfect rectangle, then I think yes. I think, well, I think I might need to take a step back from saying that. Sorry. I guess I can't say for certain, and I probably wouldn't want to take a position on that, whether I guess the trade-off of reducing the site coverage in exchange for enabling taller buildings and a more enabling recession plane, I wouldn't be confident in an answer that I'd give you about whether that trade-off would be more enabling of development as a whole or less enabling of development as a whole. I just don't know the answer to that, sorry.
Cool, thank you very much.
Okay, if there's no more questions, I've got some chair's recommendations to go forward. And there was another one that was removing that. Okay, the recommendations we've got here is that we recommend to the Policy, Finance and Strategy Committee, receives and notes the information contained in the report, receives the final draft planning instrument attached, and adopts the final intensification planning instrument as Council's proposed intensification instrument, subject to the following changes: reducing the site coverage in high density zone from 60% to 50%, reducing the walkable catchment in Petone from 1,200 metres to 800 metres, removing Wainuiomata, Eastbourne, Stokes Valley from the enabling heights and density commensurate with accessibility and demand as according to the policy 3D and 5. Oh, yeah. And the next one, changing the walkable catchment zones from 800 to 600. Try it on. So, and directs officers to notify the proposed intensification planning instrument by 20th of August and prepare a formal evaluation report for the IPI and what's the last one? And we're removing the make minor adjustments. Do we need to make any more minor adjustments? This should be it.
This is a relatively standard thing that would go in with this type of plan change. This would not be anything to change the intent of any of the provisions. It's more minor corrections.
Okay,
Yeah.
all right. It stays stead. Do I have a mover? Do I have a seconder? Okay. Do I have I move these recommendations. Do I have a seconder? And take it in parts if you like.
Sorry, we can't hear anything that's happening at the moment.
Yeah, it's okay. So I'm going to move sorry, we're going to take a break, 5 minutes. We're going to adjourn for 5 minutes. Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope our zoomed-in councillors are still with us. Okay, so we're going back to the recommendations. And I'm moving that we adopt number 3 with the changes, reducing the site coverage in high-density zone from 60% to 50%, reduce the walkable catchment Petone 1,200 metres to 800 metres, removing Wainuiomata to Eastbourne, Stokes Valley from the enabling heights and density commensurate with accessibility and demand. And we've got that policy right there. And number 5 we're deleting. It's number 4, sorry. Yeah. So everything else is the same. I'm going to move these Chair's recommendations. Do I have a seconder, please? Councillor Brown, is there any debate? Councillor Brown and then Councillor Edwards.
Thank you. This has been a long process, and we are turbocharging some really important decisions there so that we can meet the timelines for the IPI of 20th of August. So there's a lot happening and there's a lot of moving pieces. The changes, the 3 recommended changes there are all changes that are not anything out of what the MPSUD is asking us to do. This is the over and above. The reason that we've identified those 3 suburbs for the adjacent suburbs next to the city centre zones, if I've got that right, is that it is pointing to, and I've read the policy, it's pointing to that they are able to operate on their own, and it does identify kindergarten, schools, so forth. The main issue around those 3, if we are lining up to our other strategies, is that they are not self-sustaining. 95% of them leave their suburbs travelling in their cars every day. They're not next to rapid transport, and Wainuiomata, for example, has 20,000 cars leaving Wainui every day. So they aren't self-sustaining for business either. So there's reasons why those 3 have been identified and 2 have been left in. Makes sense for Moira and Avalon. And the reducing the walkable catchments in Petone, again, 1,200 to 800 is still within the new standards.
Thank you, Councillor Brown. Councillor Edwards.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. You'll be taking these separately, did I hear you say?
Yes, we'll take them separately.
Thank you. I'm relatively comfortable with the idea of reducing the site coverage and high density from 60% to 50%. I've listened to what officers had to say, and it seems a reasonable thing to do, although to me, allowing 60% site coverage in those areas where we, I guess, want to see more dense and tall sort of development rather than spread all over the city is the sensible thing to do. But I can live with sticking with the minimum that MPSUD requires us. The other ones I have more difficulty with, and in fact will be voting against those changes. I can't quite see the recommendations because it's got a participants box sitting over the top of the screen that's being shared at the moment, but I'm against reducing the walkable catchments, and I'm against removing those 3 suburbs from where we're talking about possibly allowing higher buildings, because it seems to me that we do need to build up as a city and not out, and building closer to services like shops and where transport may well go if there's more intense development is the way to go. In the next Finance Policy and Strategy meeting, we will be presented with a housing and business development assessment capacity required of us as a city. And they're quite eye-watering number of dwellings that it's projected we'll need to provide within the next 30 years. Modelling shows that we'll need around 25,000 extra houses or housing units by 2051. And the estimate that only perhaps 17,000 of those will be feasible or realisable, within current planning. So we've got to start allowing for this kind of development and try and get it in areas where we would rather see it, where there are services, and where, I would also add, where services are likely to be bolstered if we do see development there. And if we're saying that Wainuia-Mata and places like Stokes Valley and Moera might not necessarily have that level of services to sustain taller buildings, they might not now, but if we see some development around those areas, that's going to attract more shops, going to attract more rapid transit buses perhaps to take people to railway stations and so on. So we've got to kind of plan ahead. And personally, I would rather see some more intense development around those sort of commercial areas than willy-nilly 3-storey townhouse developments, three per site, spread all around the city where there might not be any services close by at all. So I would rather be trying to push developers towards putting their new apartment buildings and more intense development into those suburban commercial areas, or indeed within those walkable catchments that we've been talking about around Petone, Lower Hutt, and around the railway stations. So the only other thing I'd say, I guess it's a more minor matter, but these changes have come, in my mind, at the 11th hour. We have gone out to our community consulting on our thinking on this, and the feedback that came back to us was relatively supportive of what we were planning. There was no hue and outcry about some of the things that we were proposing. And I think that's another reason to perhaps stick to our guns and see in this next round, and probably the more important round of consultation, because then you'll be into submissions to the hearings panel and so on, what comes out. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Dyer.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yeah, share a lot of the same thoughts as Councillor Edwards on this one. I won't support the recommendation as it is at the moment. I think without the new additions. For several reasons, and like I said, Councillor Edwards has pretty much just listed them all, but we know that the current district plan only allows 68% of what we need to be providing for. So this IPI does need to go much wider than we're currently providing. How much beyond that is obviously our call through this process. But the 60 to 50% stuff, I'm not too hung up on. I can see it just creating confusion for the developer community. If we've currently allowing 60 in a zone, and once this is notified in August, we'll say, oh, actually, no, now it's 50. And then when the commissioners come back to us, they might say, oh, no, it needs to go back to 60. And then we're doing a full district plan 12, 18 months after that, where we might decide to change it back again. I can just see it getting a bit confusing for developers if we are changing from what's currently 60 back to 50. Just noting that this is only in the high density zone, the areas that are around the train stations. It's still staying at 50 for the medium density, which is obviously a reduction in what we currently allow medium density, but also noting that medium density will now be allowed in a lot more of the city than we currently allow. With the reduction of the walkable catchment in Petone, I really don't think this will make too much difference when you actually see the maps, and depending on how this passes, maybe officers could still visually show us how this would change. Like, we've seen a lot of maps to date that show the different meter marks and what that actually means. And when you start filling in a few of the gaps around train stations and the CBD, I can't see recommendation 3.2 having too much difference. And likewise for the fourth one, which has been crossed out, so that's fine. And then with the Wainui, Eastbourne and Stokes Valley one, these areas weren't put in there because they are close to, oh, what's going on? These areas weren't put in there because they are close to public transport. Why does Siri keep thinking I'm talking to it? These areas weren't put in because something I'm saying is sounding a lot like activating my Siri. Now I'm trying to think of how to say my words differently so it doesn't trigger it again. But these are areas outside of the walkable, the train station hubs, because they are close to existing facilities, but also, as Councillor Edwards says, future facilities. Noting also that some of these are in a lot of the qualifying matter zones, despite Stokes Valley being quite far up the valley and away from the harbour and the river. Until you actually turn on that layer and actually look at how bad some of the flooding issues are in Stokes Valley, it's quite likely that the qualifying matters will actually catch out a lot of these anyway. Same with Eastbourne being right down on the harbour, similar reasons there. But I think we're getting too hung up on these high density zones, thinking of them through the lens of the Plan Change 43 process we've been through, which was basically 1-2 stories for the entire city and then pockets of intensification. What we're going to see through this IPI is intensification everywhere in the city. That's going to be a drastic change from what we currently have. And in some pockets, it'll be a little bit higher, potentially. The reality is, as we know from Urban Plus, Council's development arm, that they owned a site, I would argue probably one of the best sites anywhere in the city for intensification on Jackson Street, visible to the train station. It was that close, across the road from 2 supermarkets. Probably the best site to develop on, and Urban Plus still told us it's not feasible to go to that level of intensification yet. So I think we're getting a bit too hung up on the medium density, high density. The reality is it's going to change the entire city no matter which way this goes. And we do want to see some slightly more intensification in the areas where it does make sense, but it's going to be a drastic change for the entire city.
Councillor Shaw. Thank you, Brady.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable with the additional recommendations as they're put up there, and I understand the need for future planning as outlined by Councillor Edwards, and also understand the feedback on consultation as well too. I'm pretty relaxed about it all, but at one time we talked about what we wanted our city to look like. And we talked about how the National Policy Standard had a broad brush application to how everything looks. But I think for me personally, especially the recommendation about Wainuiomata, Eastbourne and Stokes Valley is primarily really about it being well outside a rapid transport train station. And for that reason, I'd vote for that recommendation, for those recommendations.
Thank you. Is any other comment? Councillor Brown.
I know I've already commented and I apologise, but I just want to make the point around Wainuiomata that I know that the adjacent is interpretation. So the other two are not wanting to do any, are not challenging the MPUSD at all. That was the more enabling part of the recommendations. The adjacent was the interpretation, and when we are saying current status now, it might not meet it and future might, we have a long running discussion about Wainuiomata and its dependence of over the hill. And that invariably comes back to having a second road that in 1987 it was costed at 29 million. So it's never going to happen and unless there is a big change in population. So to say that Wainuiomata is going to be the growing area when it's only got 2 areas that it can further grow out, and it already does it, it's well above its proportionate development now. The interpretation of what the adjacent is, I still believe Wainuiomata, Eastbourne and Stokes Valley don't sit within it.
Okay, so we're getting on to our personal feelings now, but this is what it's all about. So this is the motion I've put forward, and we'll take them in parts. So working through 3.1, reducing the site coverage, high density zone 60 to 50%. All those in favour say aye. Aye. Councillor Braid, Dyer and Councillor Edwards.
I was voting against.
Against, 2 against. Number 2, reducing the walkable catchment in Petone from 1,200 metres to 800 metres. Aye. Same for Dyer and Edwards.
Against.
Against, thank you. And 3, removing Wainuiomā to Eastbourne Stokes Valley from the enabling building heights and densities. Aye. Got those? Yeah, and we will record those. That's, yeah. We can write that down, yeah. Councillor Edwards and Councillor Dyer. Yeah, I think Councillor Edwards was for the 50% one, weren't you, Councillor? No?
Let's say I abstain from that one.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so that's all those have passed for this meeting. And the next part is directs officers to carry out the notification, prepare the formal evaluation and report back and make any minor adjustments. Oh, and the substantive motions at the top, 1 to 3, 4, and we've recorded Councillor Dyer and Councillor Edwards' votes against those other ones and are abstaining on 3.1. Yeah, thank you. So that's us for this meeting.
Sorry, Chair, do you need to move the rest of those recommendations?
That's what we did. Okay,
Didn't vote.
I'll move the rest of those recommendations.
Yep,
Bill.
happy to second.
Thank you, Councillor Dyer. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Aye, it's passed. And is there any further debate? No, we're all passed. So I haven't received any questions. And we've got closing karakia. And Councillor Shaw is going to lead us.
If you'd like to join me in the closing karakia, unuhia, unuhia, unuhia I te uru tapu nui, kia wātia, kia mama, te nākau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara taku, koe rā e rongo, whakaere ia, ake ke runga, kia wātia, ai rā, kua wātia, haupai, marie.
Okay, and the meeting closed at 3:09.